Good afternoon
Wow.
and welcome. Hi, I'm Eric Hansen, music director, conductor of the orchestra, and much of what's about to happen in the next few hours you're going to greatly enjoy, and then there's other stuff. For those of you who don't know me, I have a straight face. My face is kind of straight right now, although actually I'm about to snare. So that part of the next few hours you may question will be my upcoming comments in introducing the program. I try to be, I don't try to be irreverent, but it tends to work out that way. And I'm the kind of person that when things are really not going well, I tend to use humor. So bear with me. If you have to leave the room briefly just to recover from something I just said, that's fine. They'll let you back in because you have one of these wonderful stickers. So that said, I'm going to be, this is our first concert this season. Thank you so much for coming. It's, you all have been living through the long list of difficulties, so I'm not going to go through them, that we've all had to deal with, as well as, of course, the musicians in the orchestra. We're very, very happy to be here, and of course, overwhelmed that you are joining us for this performance this afternoon. I have a few preface comments before I launch into my spiel before the concert begins. I will actually be introducing, if you're new to our performances, welcome. If you're a friend who's been here before one or more times, welcome back. And one of the things that I've noticed during this time, and you're of course all living this, living proof, is our resilience. It's not a word I hear or see very much in the media, and I think it's a critical word because it really defines this particular, many people's lives, of course. And at certain times we have to be resilient. We have to lean on that. But something I think I've been really all too aware of in working with students who have taught me a lot, and that is the words repose and equipoise. And I've been using those a lot. My students perhaps have heard them too many times, but they resonate with me. You know, those words are not only a little bit longer than relax, but relax is kind of a word that's lost its meaning, I think. And equipoise is such a wonderful word, not only because the way it kind of flows out of your mouth, but it refers to that thing that we all have to do in our lives and allows us to return to this place where we're well-centered, alert, and yet also at repose. And this is something that I not only try to teach my students, but I think it's an important part of who I am and how I work with groups. Is that even though I yell once in a while, more often than not I'm yelling at myself for something I've not done well. But it's because I want to remind everyone that this is the place of comfort that we come to, even when we're under duress and trying to do our best on a difficult piece of music or difficult passage or when something funny happens. And for heaven's sakes, a lot of funny and awkward things have been going on. So let me kind of matriculate into the season, as well as kind of an overview of our three composers today. First of all, I am not a conductor who likes to do theme concerts or theme seasons. That's kind of anathema to me. I like pieces to stand on their own and the composers to kind of present themselves to you via these great performers and through the pieces that we perform that they've, sweat over and worked on, and sometimes with greater facility than others, but nevertheless. And yet, I felt, especially after a year and a half of not rehearsing and having to yell at people over Zoom, which is kind of problematic for those of you who use Zoom, because if you yell, it cuts you off. It's pretty cool. Wish I'd had that with my parents. In any case, this season I decided, for a variety of reasons, to make this a season of the key of E flat major, which is a little bit obtuse and odd in the time we're living in for a variety of reasons. I'm not going to explain all the technical aspects of what a key is, but I briefly want to let you know that up until perhaps the end of the 19th century, the balance of composers, certainly throughout Western civilization music, were cognizant of the emotive qualities and the essences of each particular key. And just very briefly, we have 15 different key signatures, major keys. And for those of you who know what the little dots look like and little funny markings, in the major keys, C major has no sharps or flats. Sharps are little tic-tac-toe signs, and the flats are kind of italicized B's that come after notes. And we have 1 through 7 in the key signature flats, and 1 through 7 sharps. If you don't understand that, don't worry, and don't bother Googling it. You can do that, but you're going to get a discourse that could go on for 100 pages. What's really important is that when the composers wanted to compose a piece 150 or 200 years ago in a particular key, and they wanted that piece to have an essence at its core, not just the notes, but the essence at the core, and all the disparate parts all together, if you will, kind of purity, grace. And they would compose it in C major. If they wanted a piece to be necessarily victorious, kind of dynamic, not necessarily martial music, but nevertheless victorious and uplifting, they'd compose it in D major. On the flip side, G minor is death. Not literally, of course, but representative. So if you're writing a piece that's a requiem, you might have a section at least in G minor. We haven't so much lost, we meaning composers in the public, we haven't so much lost that as moved to a different place. Nevertheless, I thought that was kind of touching that E flat, which is not a key that orchestras play in a lot, it's for you, in case you're wondering, it's 3 flats, B, E, and A. But at the time when these theories of moods and emotions were evoked for this 150, 200 years or so up until the dawn of the 20th century, E flat represented love and to a certain degree contentment and not so much repose, but kind of settled in a matter of speaking. And I thought that was really appropriate, and it was actually quite mostly coincidence that I kind of came to that because I had remembered this from being an undergrad years ago studying these different emotions and related to different keys. And when I went back after I'd actually chosen the balance of the season, I realized, oh wow, what a great coincidence. We're opening the season with one of the great late symphonies of Haydn, number 99, which is an E flat major, and we're closing the season with Beethoven's magnificent Eroica Symphony number 3, which is an E flat. And also by odd coincidence, I had chosen for our 4th concert, Nielsen, early composer of the 20th century, dynamic, tremendous Danish composer. His 5th symphony also happens to end in a very triumphant key of E flat. So it was more than a coincidence, it was rather kind of an odd, and I don't really believe in coincidence so much. So it was kind of fortuitous. So now, just briefly, our 3 composers that I'm going to be focusing on today include really over a broad chronology of some 160 or so years of compositions. Starting, this is not the order of the program, but chronologically with our second piece, the Haydn, was composed in 1793. Haydn all 3 of these composers were quite prolific, and they composed literally not just dozens, but in several instances, hundreds of works for different forces of non-vocal instruments, as well as using the voice either as a solo instrument or a choir, or like in a mass or in a requiem. And Haydn actually composed, supposedly, in excess of 110 symphonies, which is quite a few. He was called Papa Haydn, and for a variety of reasons, which I'll maybe speak to briefly when I introduce the piece. Then also in our program is Hector Berlioz, who was an early Romantic composer, pretty much on the heels of Beethoven, and the piece we're doing for you today was composed around 1825, a couple of years before Beethoven's death, and a few years after Beethoven's magnificent Ninth Symphony. And Berlioz was one of the most progressive, not the right word, he was an expansive composer. He expanded multitudes of different aspects of especially orchestral music. He demanded or actually called for large forces in the orchestra, something that not even Beethoven did, and also experimented with the use of a lot of instruments that were not typically used in orchestras. And Berlioz composed of course, his great Symphonie Fantastique, and then a number of works that are overtures for orchestra, in addition to several operas. And the piece we're going to be doing for you today, I'll speak to this in just a few moments right before we start the program, but it was an overture to his one of his very early works, his first opera, The Court of the Secret Judges. It sounds much better in French, but you don't want to hear my French. Not even peu. So, and then the final piece on the program after intermission will be a work by Sergei Prokofiev, the very great composer of the first half of the 20th century, Russian composer, who also, as I mentioned with the other two, was very prolific and in fact composed something like a dozen operas. His first opera he composed actually at the age of 9, beating out Mozart by several years. Although the piece has not been performed, nevertheless, he was a phenomenal prodigy and a tremendous, mature composer, and who not only composed in the symphonic form, of course, as did Haydn, but also a lot of chamber music, and as I mentioned a moment ago, operas. So these three composers, very, very, very different stylistically, coming from also three very, very different places, time-wise as well as geographically, and also having very different backgrounds and demeanors. Haydn was a servant, or rather I should say wore servant's clothing for the balance of his life career, spending 30 years at Esterházy Palace outside of Vienna, where he was the Kapellmeister, the music director of the orchestra, and also charged with composing operas, symphonies, quartets for dinner parties, and the like, and songs and whatnot, and he wore the dress of the servants, the same people who deliver the food. And it was not really until the very end of his life, in the early 1790s, just before this piece was composed, that he spent 3 seasons giving public concerts, a very rare creature indeed, in London, the only place in the world, or I should say in Europe, where there were actually concerts the public was invited to and could pay, a few pennies to get in and listen to an orchestra play. And so his London symphonies, the last 12 symphonies, of which we're doing one today, 99, were dramatic works. And it's a sobering thought that in 3 years in London, 3 seasons in London, he made more money during that time and was more celebrated than in 30 years at Esterházy. And by the way, he was also awarded a doctorate by Oxford University, so we can call him Papa Doc. Oh wait, that is a bad illusion, excuse me. Doc Papa. Prokofiev, well, these 3 composers are really spectacular. The pieces, as I said, I will briefly just give you information about the specifics of each piece. And you're going to find something particularly apt and important about the resilience of this particular ensemble is that we came together all masked up in a large church room, not here, but in Berkeley, and started rehearsing in not particularly good light and not particularly great situation about 8 weeks ago, and have put together this program for you, and I really hope that you enjoy it. So in a few minutes, we'll begin.